Hello everyone, this is going to be a YouTube video that is designed to help you on track number 2, which is about the American electoral system. So I'm just going to run through the prompt and then talk about the evidence that I gave you, and so you can think about how you might want to apply the evidence in specific contexts, or how you could potentially apply the evidence to support your argument. So the prompt is develop an argument that explains whether a two-party system leads to or protects against political populism. And so the definition of populism that I gave you is the style of politics that pins the people versus the elite, right? Where populism becomes problematic is in the sense that, or it can be used pejoratively, and it often is used pejoratively in a lot of mainstream reputable publications, and of course by political scientists, or several different ways, because populists may define the people, like who's the true people are, in very nationalistic or racialized terms, versus an elite that could be defined, unfortunately, in very racialized terms, or perhaps there could be a lot of innuendo in this type of politics. But there are left-wing populists, there are right-wing populists. There's populism that I think a lot of us kind of maybe intuitively agree with. But what I mean by populism in this essay specifically, we're going to talk about a specific style of politics that aims to define a people against an elite, but it's going to be a snakesman oil or snake oil salesman type of politics, meaning a type of politics that is going to tell you what you want to hear, that is going to feed your most base desires, or maybe be rhetorically very sort of uplifting even, but is ultimately selling you snake oil, right? It's not taking into account the complexities of so many of the different social problems that we have. So that's what I mean. I'm going to use my definition of populism, at least in my essay that I am probably going to have to write Sunday, because I have a lot on my plate, sorry, will include. And so let's look at the evidence that we have. We have Brutus number 1 and Federalist number 10. And you may think intuitively, wait, how are these documents going to help me talk about the American electoral system? Well, that's what's so interesting about this class, right? This class forces you to take evidence, right? Evidence from different time periods, and to apply them to different contexts or even modern American politics. It's a fascinating class because I think the sort of subtext that exists behind that assignment is that these arguments that are being played out, right, in foundational documents like this, or the statutes or laws or constitutional clauses that you could potentially also cite, or the essay graders or the AP graders might implore you to cite on the AP exam, are still sort of alive, in the sense that there may be arguments at least attached to them, or arguments presented by them, that are still relevant to debates throughout American history, or even today. And so, in Brutus number 1, that was one of the first documents that we wrestled with. It was an anti-federalist document that was a critique of the then proposed Constitution. Remember that this critique included suspicion about the centralization of power, about the amount of power that the then proposed Constitution wanted to give and grant to the federal government. So suspicion about the federal government, and also suspicion about the executive branch and the power granted to the executive branch specifically. Federalist number 10 tries to assuage that suspicion, or tries to assuage it. Brutus number 1, I should also mention, has a deep suspicion of, so I'll just put suspicion of centralized power, of a strong executive, and it also has deep suspicion of large republics, which it claims, Brutus number 1 claims, essentially dilutes the powers of of people, right? People are going to become disaffected because the politics that their representatives engage in are not going to mirror their interests, right? And so this is a recipe for tyrannical rule, according to Brutus number 1, right? Rule that we are not going to like in any sense. And then Federalist number 10 presents an interesting counter-argument. Federalist number 10 articulates this idea that, you know what, hold on, large republics are better. Large republics are good. That they actually lead to less, or they in large republics, in larger republics, or sort of more centralization of power into centralized authority is actually going to lead to less tyranny. And the sort of rationale behind this is that it forces people who are fundamentally horrible human beings and self-interested human beings, and forces people that are engaged in factions to compete over larger and larger territory, right? And this competition sort of dilutes their interests, dilutes their ability to capture the government, right? Dilutes the ability to capture the government and essentially enact their will, or use the government to accrue their interests, right? So this definitely, Brutus number 1 would perhaps endorse a more participatory model of democracy, and Federalist number 10, we said, would endorse a more pluralist model of democracy, sort of several competing interests is kind of what we would imagine with a pluralist conception of democracy. And so what's interesting about these documents, particularly Federalist number 10, is the ways in which that we can apply them to this debate about the two-party system, right? And so I think we all kind of recognize, right, that a lot of Americans, and maybe some of you too, feel disaffected, right, in some sense, by, or dismayed by the fact, or maybe kind of, or I suppose dismayed by our two-party system, right? I know, several of you said, there have been elections where it's as if you're choosing the least worst candidate, or a candidate that might not reflect everything that you want, or maybe too moderate for your liking, or way too extreme for your liking, right? It's like choosing the least bad candidates all the time in a two-party system, right? And so that's interesting. So there's this sort of idea within Brutus number 1 that perhaps a two-party system is not reflecting accurately people's interests, right? Perhaps it's not reflecting accurately people's interests, right? But in Federalist number 10, there's this, also, we can think of like a two-party system as sort of, being kind of paradoxical in some sense. How could it be that so many people in the United States today identify with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or are willing to vote for the Democratic Party or Republican Party, and those are the ones that only seem to have viable chances of winning elections in our system, when there are 330 million people in the United States? How could that be possible? Shouldn't we expect more competition? And perhaps Federalist number 10 would be equally dismayed, right? And I think they would. They would be dismayed about the two-party system, but there's sort of political science behind why we ended up with a two-party system, right? Sort of Federalist number 10 would be kind of dismayed and essentially upset, right, that we have a system that produces only a chance of two parties to win, right? There's this Great Atlantic article that I'll include in the description that kind of is interesting, right, to thinking about how could we have ended up with how do we live in a republic today where so many of us throughout the country, with presumably different economic interests and social interactions or different types of cultures, have been socialized to accept sort of different party positions or ideological positions that kind of emanate or are reflected in the Republican and Democratic parties, right? maybe we're more left than the Democratic Party, maybe we're conservative than the Democratic Party, maybe we're more left than the Republicans, or more conservative than traditional Republicans. But nonetheless, I think a lot of us find a lot of agreement, no matter, like if we're a Democrat or a Republican, can find a lot of agreement on a whole range of issues. If we, say, traveled to Idaho and found another Democrat or another Republican, like we would agree on so many different sort of points. And why is that so? Well, there's an interesting Atlantic article that says that the Federalist Number 10 didn't take into account the rise of the mass media, right? The rise of information technologies that can help link us together and kind of help socialize and change our cultures and change our values and kind of standardize our cultures and values. Sort of diffusing the vision of Federalist Number 10 of a democracy and a republic with several competing interest groups, an inherently unstable interest group alliance in order to prevent those interest groups from capturing the state. Right? Presumably, right? We can apply these documents so many different ways. I also want to just take a note that says these documents can be applied so many different ways too. We can apply these documents actually to the essay on develop an argument that explains which of the three forms of the civil rights essay, right? We can think about the ways in which how British Number 1's influence, right, the Anti-Federalist influence over our constitutional republic is reflected in the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, place prohibitions and restrictions on the powers of Congress, right? There's a deep suspicion in those texts, right? The Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. That wouldn't happen until later through what is called selective incorporation. But the Bill of Rights applies to the federal government. So there's a deep suspicion over the centralization of power, over the giving of authority to a central government that is embedded in our constitutional republic. But we can see, right, when we looked at the end of the Civil War, right, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is an amendment that places restrictions on the states. It says the states cannot deny individuals the right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Talks about how states cannot deny individuals the privileges and immunities of citizenship. The Equal Protection Clause, right? These are all that's just from the 14th Amendment specifically. The 15th Amendment talks about voting rights.
Good afternoon, Dragons. It is Friday. We are going to begin dismissal. Academy, we will release pre-K through second grade. Pre-K through second grade. College prep, bus 1, 4, and 7. Bus 1, 4, and 7 are now dismissed.
In the 15th Amendment, it says that states can make no laws barring individuals from voting on account of race, right? So there's a sort of restriction and a suspicion of the power of states, right? And valid one, if I might add, right? And so it's an interesting, and the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, becomes the mechanism by which the Supreme Court would eventually apply the amendments in the Bill of Rights to the states, but they do it piece by piece, right? In fact, not all bits of the Bill of Rights have actually been applied to the states, right? They do it selectively through a method called selective incorporation, right? That's, a lot of people have this misconception that the Bill of Rights are binding on states. No, they've become binding on states thanks to the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, which has been a mechanism the Supreme Court has used to apply the Bill of Rights to states. Right, so we can see reflected in our founding document, the Bill of Rights has sort of a suspicion of the power and centralization in the federal government, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment places restrictions and prohibits the states from acting in certain ways, right? Restrictions and grants a range or forces states to grant a range of protections, right? And we can use these documents in that context as well. So I can take them over there and throw them to that side of the board where I have the civil rights essay. But anyways, back to this. Then we can also use Federalist number 51. That's kind of the classic text. Ambition made to counteract ambition. Men are inherently horrible people, right? They are not angels. That's essentially me paraphrasing the text. And so we need to create a government where there is tension, there is overlapping authorities, there is separations of powers, where there are checks and balances, because people are ambitious, they're greedy, they're self-interested, right? And so we can apply this perhaps to our argument as well, and I'll talk about that towards the end. But let's also think about Duverger's law. Why do we get a two-party system? This is the political science in this sort of essay. We get a two-party system because we have what is called single-member plurality representation. What this reflects is this idea that our districts, we allocate seats in the House and in the Senate by in a winner-take-all system, meaning the person that wins the majority of the votes takes all the votes. Well, what this does is it disincentivizes people from picking perhaps the candidate that they are most identify with intuitively, or the candidate's positions that they most like, if that person is only going to acquire like 10% or 8% of the vote, right? Those 10% of voters need to go to a candidate that has a greater chance of winning, right? And if we played this game out, what we would end up getting with is a situation, right? And obviously, if you play this game out, in electoral systems characterized by single-member plurality, right? You get two-party systems. And this is an important insight. In electoral systems characterized by single-member plurality districts, in winner-take-all districts, you get two-party systems. And if you're like kind of trying to wrap your head around like what the heck is a winner-take-all system, let's do it by understanding what is not. So like a proportional representation or a proportional voting system would be one in which, let's say there's one district, right? And instead of this district being represented by the person that has the most amount of votes, let's say
Academy, we will release 3rd through 5th grade. 3rd through 5th grade are now dismissed.
let's say there are 15 candidates or so, and the seats are allocated based on districts. So maybe there will be like 4 or 5 seats in this district, and perhaps the candidate with the most amount of votes will get 2 seats, but then the candidate with the second most amount of votes may get 1 seat, or so on and so forth, right? That's kind of a proportional representation system. What we have here is a system where we have one candidate, they could win maybe 50% of the vote, and they can win the whole district, right? And the other 50% will be left disaffected, and so therefore we're left with a two-party system. And so Duverger's law, if we have single-member plurality districts, remember this, single-member plurality districts, we end up with a two-party system.
Have a great weekend, Jordan.
The median voter theorem is this interesting game theoretic idea, right? We're not going to play this game, but maybe perhaps after the microeconomics exam we can play this game. But it's this idea, if you have 2 players or 2 candidates in a game, they are going to be incentivized to get as close as possible to the median voter, right? To essentially move as close as possible to the middle, because they run the risk if they don't move as close as possible to the middle. So let's say what am I from your perspective? I'm a left-wing candidate. The right-wing candidate is going to get as close as possible to the middle, because if they stayed all the way over here, then the right-wing candidate can just get as close as possible to the middle, and presumably peel off some of the support that I would receive and get all of the support from people all the way to the right of that candidate, right? But if I get close as possible to the middle, then all these people that are much more liberal than me have to vote for me, right? Or at least I would be their second worst I would be the sort of least bad option for them, right? They may be super far left, but from their perspective, I'm the least bad option, right? So it's this kind of game theoretic idea, and we do see the median voter theorem in American politics. But what's weird in American politics is we also have primary systems now, right? Before, in the 60s, parties used to choose their candidates who received the nomination. Now we've democratized the process. And what's problematic about democratizing the process is that only the most ideologically involved people actually show up in the primaries. So there's this incentive, right, in the general election to move close to the median voter. But in the primaries, to win the primaries, you have to be way over here sometimes. Right? If I'm a left-wing sort of candidate, I have to be all the way over here. If I'm a right-wing candidate, then I have to be further to the right. And sometimes it's really hard to move towards the middle and still make an appearance of being a genuine sort of candidate. And so this is an interesting idea that I think I can apply in different ways to my argument. The Southern strategy, we talked about it. It was sort of this Nixon strategy, this response, this pushback to the expansion of civil rights in the 60s to use sort of racial dog whistles, right? Talk about law and order to sort of convince and peel off voters from the South that felt, all sorts of racial grievances about the progress that particularly African Americans had made in the 60s, right? So we can also talk about this. Baker versus Carr, this is a famous Supreme Court ruling which says that, all it says is that, I don't want to get into it fully, but all it says is that Supreme Court cases brought before courts regarding districting are just justiciable, meaning that courts can actually hear them, right? Previously, courts have said, elections, those are stuff that are run state by state. We have a deep respect for federalism. But in Baker versus Carr, which took place, let me actually look for the specific date. Oh, I don't have the specific date. I think it was in the 1960s. Tennessee had not redistricted their electoral, had not engaged in redistricting for 60 years. And in Baker versus Carr, the court did not make a ruling on that, but they did say that it was justiciable because districting could potentially, or the ways in which states choose to organize their districts could have could implicate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? Could potentially be violative of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, sort of this one vote, one voice doctrine, right? This embrace of this one vote, one voice doctrine. But obviously there are complications to this. In Shaw versus Reno, the court wrestled with the question whether North Carolina in 1990 could create, through intentional discrimination, a majority-minority district in North Carolina. African Americans were a minority in North Carolina, but the North Carolina legislature wanted to create a majority-minority district. The rationale allegedly was to increase African American representation in Congress. Some more suspicious reasons offered was perhaps to sort of dilute the power of African Americans to raise sort of, or actually no, I better not comment on that. I'll just put a link in the description on Shaw versus Reno, right? The court determined that the creation of majority-minority districts, so the intentional racial discrimination, even if for benign purposes or allegedly benign purposes, was unconstitutional and violative of the Equal Protection Clause. However, courts have also ruled that partisan gerrymandering is okay. You just can't use race. You just can't engage in racial gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is one of the last words or terms we have. It's this idea of manipulating voting districts in such a way to give your political party a partisan advantage, right? So maybe you want to put all the Democrats if you're a Republican in one district, or all the Republicans in one district if you're a Democrat, or maybe you want to sort of create districts in such a way in like certain, like maybe 40% Democrat and then 60% Republican, so you can pick up all the seats, or vice versa, the same logic. That's kind of what gerrymandering is. And then finally, the Citizens United versus FEC. I added this case, but I know I didn't give it to you, but you can feel free to integrate it into your essay. This Supreme Court ruling, let me specifically get out my notes on this so I can be incredibly accurate. This Supreme Court ruling overturned Austin versus the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. So in that Supreme Court ruling in 1990, the holding in Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, the holding was that it was okay for the Michigan legislature to prohibit corporations from making independent expenditures to support or oppose candidates. The rationale was corporate wealth can unduly influence elections. And so the assumption behind that was that corporations don't have the same First Amendment rights as individuals. In the Citizens United case, Citizens United had planned to advertise a film critical of Hillary Clinton in TV shops shortly before the 2008 primary, but federal law had prohibited corporations and unions from making electioneering communications within, I think it's 30 days of a primary or election, or 60 days of an election, or to make any expenditure advocating for the election or defeat of a candidate. But in 2010, the court ruled that Congress may not limit independent corporate expenditures because the First Amendment rules, right, and money is speech. So no, another sort of assumption was that there was no risk of corruption. Right, so Citizens United, and really actually a whole slew of judicial precedents that we don't have time to really get into, it's kind of been the symbolic case for the way in which the judiciary has kind of opened the floodgates, in the view of critics, to increasing access of increasing money in politics, particularly opening the floodgates for corporations to spend a lot of money in politics. Now, I will note that the rise of super PACs follows shortly after a Citizens United decision. Those are what are called political action committees. Those are committees that can choose to operate in two ways. They can choose to operate opaquely, or they can choose to operate in a way that is a bit more transparent. If they choose, depending on how they choose to incorporate, and this gets very technical, but essentially corporations have, campaigns are limited in the amount that they can actually, there's a whole slew of Supreme Court rulings that don't limit the expenditures that individuals can actually spend in elections, but they have limits on contributions that individuals can spend in elections. And also, oh my goodness, also make sure I am saying this right. Yeah, so corporations' contributions to campaigns are limited, like the dollar amount, but you can't limit their expenditures, and you also can't limit corporations' expenditures to independent sort of organizations that are engaged in elections. And then super PACs can be very opaque depending on how they choose to incorporate. There can be a 527 super PAC, which can raise and spend money to specifically and directly influence political activity, but they must report their donors. Or there can be a 501c4 super PAC, which is essentially a nonprofit, which has exemptions for civic and commercial organization that focus exclusively on social welfare. But the 501c4 super PAC, as long as they spend about 51% of their money that they receive from a range of different individuals or potentially corporations on social welfare, and that can be broadly defined. They can spend the remaining 49% on attempting to directly influence politics. Okay, so rise of super PACs associated often with the Citizens United decision. So how do we integrate this all together, right? There's so many ways to integrate this evidence together. I am going to think that one could make a plausible argument that the two-party system enables political populism because it leads to disaffection in the political process and people that feel their voices aren't heard, and also enables unified government, meaning since parties are so ideologically sorted nowadays, it enables unified government to have a profound impact and influence on the trajectory of the United States, and potentially enabling tyranny of the majority and stuff like that. Perhaps that way. All right, I'm going to end the YouTube video.